Thank you so much for joining us today for the second in our discussion series on Black ecologies, centering themes of extraction, disposability, and resistance. I'm not going to, I'm so eager to jump into our guest person, but I won't. I'll just give you a bit of background about how this came together and thank some of our folks for helping us before we get grooving. So again, for those of you who joined us last week, you know that this effort builds on an effort between Justin Hosby and I to think about Black ecologies and geographies in community with artists and organizers, to imagine horizons beyond extraction and disposability, and to draw on the histories of Black resistance to racism and ecocide as twin forces to interrupt the current degradation and death, and to chart alternative horizons for ourselves and our communities, germane to Black histories and socialities. We've written together. We have a forthcoming piece in Southern Cultures, and we also just good homies. So that's always good to work with your folks, your friends, in that way. We're of course indebted intellectually in this work to so many thinkers in Black geography and environmental thought. And just like last week, we won't rehearse those for fear that we might miss some important folks. Um, but we are heavily indebted to all kinds of mentors and folks. I'm particularly indebted to Claudrina Harold and Wendy Marshall, who really gave me models as an undergraduate about how to think, act, and create in the service of Black possibility, liberation, art, and futures. For this particular program, we'd also really like to thank our co-conspirators in pulling the program together: Emerald Rutledge, Ph.D. candidate in English literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Leah Kaplan, PhD student in philosophy at Emory. And if you all were here last week, you have the pleasure of already having met Alexis Young, a standout star undergraduate 4+1 journalism major here at ASU. Without all of their contributions to help bring together the themes and to compose this program, none of this would be possible. We're also really grateful to our sponsors um, at ASU's Institute for Humanities Research, the School of Social Transformation, and where I'm housed here, Deans Moldavi and Cohen in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dean Boone in the College of Global Futures, the School of Philosophical and Religious Studies, um, Historical and Religious Studies, the Digital Humanities Initiative, and the Environmental Humanities Initiative. We'd also really like to thank Jeannie Colquette, Kike Palacios in SST, Selena Osuna, Lauren Whitby, and the tireless Liz Grumback over at IHR. um, None of this would be possible without those good folks, so we really appreciate you all. I'd also like to shout out People Strike, which emerged last May out of a call from leaders at Cooperation Jackson who were calling for mass action against the conditions of disposability that COVID, the discourse of essential workers, and police murders brought directly to the forefront of our collective consciousness. In many ways, our efforts to bring together these materials and this dialogue comes out of work with People Strike, and particularly their demands to decarbonize the economy, and also to institute food sovereignty. Um, please join us again next week for another robust discussion on Wednesday next week at the same time, 2:30 Pacific, 5:30 Eastern. I want to say, again, this is a slightly different forum than we had last week and next week, which are more open discussions. But we still do encourage you all to use the chat to underscore things that you think are really going on and happening for you in these discussions. Please also use the Q&A when it's time to engage, just so that we have a central site where folks can keep track of your questions and make sure that we're getting to as many of them as we can. And please also know that we have an automatic closed captioning set up for those who would like to use that. I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Justin Hosby, who will tell us a bit more and keep us moving.
Yes, thank you, JT. I want to first say it's an honor today to introduce Dr. Rashad Shabazz. Dr. Shabazz is Associate Professor in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. Dr. Shabazz's intellectual work critically explores human geography, Black cultural studies, gender studies, and prison studies, adult Black studies scholar overall. His research explores the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender, and the production of space. I was happy to meet Dr. Shabazz for the first time at the American Association of Geographers meeting in New Orleans, but I had already been inspired by so much of his work since I was in graduate school. I learned so much from my engagement with Dr. Shabazz. He taught me a few things about New Orleans that I did not know before, so thank you for that. His 2015 book, Spatializing Blackness, Architectures of Confinement and Black Masculinity in Chicago, another really dope Black studies text, examines how carceral power within the geographies of Black Chicagoans shape urban planning, housing policy, policing practices, gang formation, high incarceration rates, masculinity, and health. And again, his work has been really instructive for my own work in New Orleans. I've taught this book in my undergraduate courses, anthropology courses on Black geographies, and engaged with it in my own work, so I recommend the text highly. Professor Shabazz's scholarship has appeared in Souls, the Spatial Justice Journal, ACME, Gender, Place, and Culture, and Occasions, and he has published several book chapters and book reviews. I'm happy to introduce him today. Thank you for being here, Dr. Shabazz.
Thank you for that really, really wonderful introduction. I very much appreciate it, and I have mad respect for both of y'all brothers. Y'all are really carrying this legacy of Black geographies forward, and the future is bright because you all are a part of it. Well, it's my real honor, duty, and responsibility to introduce our keynote, the reason that we are all here today. Dr. Andrea Roberts is an assistant professor of urban planning at Texas A&M University, an associate director of the Center for Housing and Urban Development. She holds a Ph.D. in community and regional planning at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as an MA in government administration from the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in political science from Vassar. Her 14 years of experience in community development and government administration inform her efforts to move disappearing African-American communities facing sprawl, gentrification, and resource extraction from the margin to the center of public discourse. In 2014, she founded the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, a research and social justice initiative. Through its student researchers, ethnographic methodologies, community-based collaborations, and really amazing online atlas. And I don't know if we have that in the chat or not, but we have to share that. The project makes visible the public practitioners and policymakers, disparate ecological and development impacts on historic Black communities. She's produced public scholarship and published articles on the intersectionality of the National Trust of Historic Preservation, rural Black women's policymaking in the Journal of Planning History, Black women's placemaking and participatory preservation practices in buildings, landscapes, Forum Journal, the Journal of American Planning Association, and the Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage. She's also a member of Texas's State Board of Review, which advises SHOP concerning National Register nominations, and the Mellon Foundation as National Monument Audit Advisory Board. Dr. Roberts is a 2021 Writing Public Engagement Fellows and was a 2020 Visiting Scholar at Yale's Gelder Lehman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. She's currently writing a book about grassroots Black historic preservation practices for the University of Texas Press. It is my honor to introduce our featured speaker today, Dr. Andrea Roberts.
Thank you so much for having me. And before I begin, I want to first acknowledge that I speak to you from Texas and from Bryan, Texas, home of the Tonkawa and Santa people on whose land we live and work. This is me. This is great-grandma Hester Allen and her mother, Emma Brown, born 1876. Tail end of Reconstruction. This is my earliest memory of a womanist placemaking ecology. They were at the center of a system of care. This map is that system of care. It's a little bit Riceville, also known as Southwest Houston, Harris County, a little bit Fort Bend, a little bit Missouri City, and a little bit Sugarland, where I was born behind a sugar refinery adjacent to where convict leasing victims labored until they died. I'd later learned this was also a Black settlement migration pattern that would become buried beneath sprawl, reconstructed as an exodus from our first Black communities, when so many of our first Black communities were actually here in Fort Bend, where my family had been enslaved since 1830. And from there onward, I became obsessed with places in which I could feel or help create the kind of belonging I felt in my womanist place ecologies, and to create it for others in cities. To think of my roots is to think of Houston, of leading city planning and engagement in communities thought to be concentrations of Black population, but not actual communities. Upper right, or rather upper right would be my great-grandma and grandma in Riceville, and below my mother's mother with her sisters in Independence Heights, 2 Black settlements. But when I was a child, these weren't named places as much where grandma stay. They were named for the women, you see. But increasingly, I wanted to know more about these women who struggled to be heard and seen during public meetings in the places that remained even when I lost the women that lived there. When I first began doing family history, as so many of us do when we get to a certain age, I sifted through funeral programs and family photos. Fewer than a handful of descendants live within a few miles of the cemetery where Mrs. Hester Allen, my great-grandmother, is buried. And without the photos, the programs, and the family telephone tree, I wouldn't understand what FIS cemetery is or was. Hidden in social memory, womanist knowledge emerged from my grandmother's kin-keeping, the keeping of these programs, these funeral programs. Otherwise, I would have never made the connection between FIS, which was Farmers Improvement Society, and my family and a freedom colony. Farmers Improvement Society created a safety net and economic growth strategy for rural African Americans in Texas, especially in freedom colonies. Here you see R.L. Smith, who was a protege of Booker T. Washington, who founded the organization. And Smith's first wife actually founded what's called the Women's Barnyard Auxiliary, which specialized in teaching women chicken farming methods and household budgeting. When I stayed with my great-grandma, she raised chickens. I never knew why. Then I learned. So the platform was revolutionary of this organization that actually ended up having 21,000 members. They weren't just the keepers of the cemetery. They were a national organization with 21,000 members. And my Aunt Ruby was also a member, and I came across her photograph in the same bag full of programs. And Ruby, a photograph here leaning against a Model T Ford she purchased on her own in the 1920s. According to family members, she was large and imposing, enough to buck convention in several ways. And the agency that she embodied, simultaneously affirmed by her accumulation of wealth and violated by her inappropriate clothing and marital status, really overturned a lot of popular constructions of what we think of when we think about racial uplift. But she was racial uplift. And I investigated the influence that FIS women like Ruby had on the organization's other members and on these communities. And what I found is that they not only promoted land ownership, but a certain type of financial literacy, a literacy that connected household saving to that of the security and the liberation of whole communities from sharecropping. And here you see an example of one of those budgets that they constructed, that is the Women's Barnyard Auxiliary. They would publish these in various journals of the time, that is magazines. And what's so interesting is that one of the members or leaders, Grace Johnson of Oakland, Texas, Johnson, when asked, what is it that Women's Barnyard Auxiliary is really for? What is your motto? She would say, We are after property, new methods, and bank accounts. She explained to the reporter, and this is actually in the New York Daily Tribune in the 1900s, we aim to study the nature, habits, needs, and wants of poultry, hogs, cows, and all domestic animals with a view to improving the stock and putting it with the products of the land on the market in such condition that it shall command a remunerative price. And they also gave papers at their own annual conferences, such as the utilization of the odds and ends about a farm. And that was a paper by a woman from Kendleton Freedom Colony named G.A. Allen. And Mrs. Estella Wyatt wrote a position paper on the part that colored women can play in the agricultural regeneration of the South. And so I come from these womanist placemakers and these place keepers, and they have much to tell us in this moment when we stand on the precipice of great societal change and so-called repair. And I want to bring this heritage and these practices into conversation with or into dialogue with these coming changes in policy through which we can either shift or reify corruptive relationalities between land, Black communities, and our life chances. I'll begin with aims and claims, what I want us to wrestle with together, and then the fundamental assumptions and definitions informing the talk, and then where womanist placekeeping takes place, what the practices are, and what it is that they are resisting, that is the extraction, the land loss. And then I'll speak to the relevance of this to engage research practice in our emerging new age of land and resource redistribution, particularly related to rural farmers and those who own forest land in Texas. So my aims are to explore these questions. What are the forces within and without complicating placekeeping and disrupting attempts at balance in Black place sovereignty? What's the significance of these womanist placemaking, or in the case of today, placekeeping practices, to our current challenges and policy formations as they're related to land stewardship, ownership, extraction, and communicide? And I ask these questions based on some starting claims that African Americans have engaged in planning and placemaking keeping for centuries. Before 1909, and there was a planning department at Harvard, there were African Americans scratching out, creating place. Two womanist placekeeping practices provide evidence of that, and that is place preservation and kinkeeping, which I'll focus on today. And womanist placemaking ecology then is concerned with the interlocking oppressions, domination of women, Black folks, and the land, which challenges the way we enumerate people in place, which also ascribes value, and reinforces covenants of care and new relationalities between people and land rooted in belonging. And so as I throw around the word ecologies, I do want to contextualize it that I'm speaking of a feminist political ecology term, science of survival, which explains the way women's valuable local knowledge about land management and agricultural practices explain how women, quote, develop and maintain their integrative abilities to deal with complex systems of household, community, and landscape. And of course, kinkeeping, which is reclaiming and counting people or places I refer to as outside children, and knitting people and their land back together through recollection and truth-telling, which exemplifies womanism because this practice involves Black women, expresses ideas with maturity and audacity, maintains a celebratory attitude toward and love of the complexity and messiness of life, and are proponents of a culturally situated gender justice, and account for a paradoxical relationship to the land and the environmental. And that paradox is that land is simultaneously something in which we have artfully lived in balance, but it has also been the spaces of environmental justice, the horrors of the lynching tree, the spaces of our oppression of sharecropping. And in times we have become complicit in a system of white supremacy that harms the land. And so we wrestle with the paradox of living with this land in this system. And of course, place preservation, which is place persistence, a form of resistance to place erasure. And so the spaces in which we're talking about this are freedom colonies. These are historic African-American settlements founded between 1865 and 1930, mostly in bottomland and coastal areas near former plantations, primarily because the publicly available land for homesteading after emancipation was not by law available to African Americans. So they took the land that was available, and that was often the land available. And by 1910, we owned 31% of all farmland in Texas, on which we created these intentional places, often anchored by churches, schools, and cemeteries. And when beginning this research, there were more than 557 of these places that I was able to identify by name, but not necessarily by place. And so if there were hundreds of them in Texas alone, where are they? And why in the world would we not know that there are 557 of them? Well, there are historical causes of their disappearance: the Great Migration, violence, population loss, infrastructure projects, deferred maintenance, invisibility, out-migration in part because of the racial violence. And in the present, municipal underbounding. We know about the great work of Daniel Pufroy, who talks about extraction and poor municipal services in places like Tamina. And then we have disasters and hazards. And so what the map is showing is the great concentration of 229 freedom colonies within the 43 counties impacted by Hurricane Harvey. And finally, land loss and land dispossession. When a recent study showed that Black farmers, 61% of them lacked proper infrastructure, they had poor access to the internet, and we have 95% of farmers are white. Of the 3.4 million producers leaving as a paltry 1.3% of Black farmers, and 76% of African Americans don't have wills and have land intestate. And Black farmland, we now own less than 90, we now own less than 1 million acres cumulatively. But when I began my research years ago in East Texas, and many of you are probably already familiar with this area and my work in that area, the field work, what I found was a bit of a paradox in this space that has an association with racial violence, the drag and death of James Byrd. I also found beauty in a celebration of Black freedom. And so in this deep East Texas region landscape, it holds the lungs of the Southeast in a way. That is, it holds the Big Thicket, which is a forest that the National Park Service manages. That's 113,000 acres. And this is also the livelihood, the language, and what colors and helps people understand life behind what people call the pine curtain, images such as these. And this is Shankleville. And this is one of many communities I visited and spent time with and developed relationships with people here to understand the ways that they connected their foundational stories of their origins to their current practices, the ways that they reconnected people to place and cultivated commitment. And I found that there were foundational stories that enabled them to foster place attachment through these celebrations and social networks, and that this encouraged participation and actually led to tangible planning outcomes. But I wanted to know if Shankleville was a special case, so to speak, or if it was really about a set of, or a variety of practices among African Americans in these places. And so before and after emancipation, the racialization of landscapes has overshadowed a lot of culturally relevant kinship types and forms of land ownership. And that's what I would come to learn about through these women known as kinkeepers. Hortense Spillers describes the ambiguity in the accounting of Africans as cargo on the way to the New World, disconnected from their groups of origins, gender roles, naming conventions, or the manner in which they constructed kinship ties. Captive, enumerated Black people would be bundled and stacked in ship hulls, enumeration, accounting, and categorization of people in places as agents of abstraction. And because these forms of data and associated analysis are thought to be objective, questioning their underlying assumptions are discouraged. Kinkeepers disrupt this accounting. And they disrupt it by articulating connections between people and places. They maintain family relationships via various activities, planning family rituals or reunions, coordinating family caregiving, serving as a repository of family kinship and medical information. Characterized as a mostly female hobby, kinkeepers collect and manage information about belonging and beginnings. And among kin keepers in the Freedom Colony Network that I first studied, I generalized what I observed, their practices of conjuring and quilting. Their practices conjure the names and offspring through careful prodding at community events and quilting together their relationships to each other and the land. And at other times, the kin keeper is simultaneously exposing and legitimizing family structures and relationships dismissed and shaped elsewhere. And so the women I interacted with while conducting research often spoke of those who fell outside the scope of the Western construction of family and respectability as outside children or the outside child. However, kin keepers allocated space in their stories and family narratives for this unkempt notion of family and land ownership that included multiple marriages, prodigal children, and lapsed church membership. The kin keepers embrace and integrate seemingly errant people or places back into the stories of communities, church foundings, and land acquisition, thereby reconstituting disassembled remnants into place. Men's second families or outside children, offspring conceived outside marriage, are integrated into the family and place narrative. Gwen Blewett, who you see here on the right and in the middle on one of the tours, would talk about her work as a kin keeper as being edifying, as something that fulfilled her. She would say, I asked her why she thought it was so important, and she'd say, just like you coming back home. It's like you're going back home. Even though I was not reared here, this is a part of my heritage. I think a lot of people don't feel the same way I do about the cemetery. I think there's a connection that takes you way back. These relationships to people, memory, and spaces also inform contemporary covenants of care. And Lily White recalls the roots of that care. She said that we'd walk the women. If somebody gets sick, they take the old lamps, the lights like splinters, pine splinters, and they go to people's house and put on these high top shoes and walk the people out and set up all night with them. And all of those old ladies, we went to see about them. These were the covenants of care. And among the 50 descendants that I spent time with, in addition to Gwen Blewett, there's Gwen Carter, who's the keeper of this amazing homecoming calendar, which is not just an event calendar, but it attests to the existence of places often anchored by churches in which they would have these annual celebrations that would draw people from not only Houston and Dallas and Beaumont, but from around the world back to these communities where they would inevitably be buried. And I was able to visualize places that seemed disconnected, placeless, and orphaned because kin keepers allocated space in their family and place narratives for unkept notions of family and land ownership that included multiplicities, multiple names, multiple moments, multiple ownerships. And the kin keepers embrace and integrate these stories into their current understanding of these spaces and land. So while touring and telling these stories, I would take photos and I would geotag them. And I started out thinking there were 14 settlements, but saw that there were many more. There were many more with what they call Black pockets. I also met Irene Clack Palmer, born in 1944 in Newton County. She is now the late Irene Palmer. And she lives in Pleasant Hill Settlement, Pleasant Hill Community, rather. This is a settlement that is anchored by this remaining church. And she is a descendant of the Powell and King families who were once enslaved on the Far Plantation, for which there is a historical marker. There is no marker for Pleasant Hill. Though the only anchor exists that is that church, and homecoming takes place there, and it has taken place there since 1930, Palmer has, or she used to, be the church secretary that ensured everyone returned. And by contributing during these events, they were able to take care of the cemetery, pay insurance for the building and other annual expenses. But Palmer lives on her homestead on the road beside this one. So that was County Road 1067. This is County Road 1066. She's the lone resident. At one time, it was a big community. She said all they did was farm and take care of children. If one had, all had. Everybody was on the same level All they had back in the day was logging and loading and plucking wood on hands and shoulder. They supported their families that way. She described the landscape as across the creek was cousins, kinfolks there together. We raised and farmed on the land. Grandparents on daddy's side were there. The Kings lived up there near the church. It is where I grew up, and that is where I will stay. Like Dorothy said, there's no place like home. And I asked her why she, like most of the people impacted by hurricanes, didn't just take all of that recovery money, hurricane recovery money. And she said to me, they came around here wanting to give me a house, 2 bedrooms, but 1 bath. I said, no, I'll be in this house until the Lord get me, or it don't burn down, or the next storm blow it away. And she said she preferred this current home and the freedom to expand as she deemed necessary. But there are challenges and threats to this inner and outer expansion and claiming of space. There are challenges to persisting in place, one of which is Hancock Life Insurance Company. And while it didn't challenge her, it does challenge the sense of place. And unlike those around her, Palmer and her sisters were determined not to sell. And even when all the other relatives sold their homesteads, they kept the property and the property taxes current. And according to Palmer, absentee, poor, and working class and elderly landowners in Pleasant Hill often had unclear titles, leaving them susceptible to working with deceptive area landowners. And she explained that land had been going from hand to hand, 100 plus acres, they sold out. Palmer, surrounded by forest and people who actually go into the forest and steal land, or steal forest or timber from the land at night, surrounded her. Thankfully, she had estate planning. She had a son who worked for an attorney. And so she was able to ensure that her name was on the land and that there was a succession plan. But such estate planning is essential as the area timberlands become increasingly attractive to Hancock Timber Resource Group. And what is that? Well, Hancock Timber is one of hundreds of TIMOs. These are timber investment management organizations that manage institutional investors' timberland investment portfolios for shareholder gain more than ecology. And they own 50 million acres worth $40 billion, have changed hands over the last 30 years. And Hancock is a transnational operation. So we all know Hancock Insurance, but they actually now own all of this forested land and they operate now out of Canada. And while these companies share some interest in land conservation, they're less likely to engage in conservation of settlement patterns unknown to most appraisal districts. So they own 69% of the forest in places like Alabama, where their extraction happens in the form of tax benefits. And so there are researchers like Connor Bailey, a rural sociologist who writes about these places becoming internal colonies. So they own now 26% of Texas forest land. And the holdings have changed in value 46% in the last 5 years. And this coincides with rising taxes, partition sales, settlement patterns dissipating, and wealth lost. The other challenge, of course, is legal subterfuge. She said plenty land was owned by J.L. Lanier. There was white-owned land nearby. My cousin, O'Neill Booker, his wife is old, Mamie Booker. As soon as he died, white folks said O'Neill never owned that land. And a lawyer was working on it. Booker had fenced it in and farmed it. Younger white folks have tried to take it from him. And I asked her, so how's this taking occur? And Palmer explained that, quote, in Newton County, sometimes they take tax from 2 different folks for the same land, get money from whoever brings it in there. And so Palmer had a very, very firm, clear realization and understanding of this system of extraction violating her land at night, people stealing the timber, and of the regime of extraction and how it worked, and the regime of disposability of Black places and erasure of Black places through this selling of land to TMOs, to this taxation, these taxation schemes, which exploited people who thought that they actually owned the land. And so how is it that any of this actually addresses or aids in thinking about research? The Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which is the work that I do, is indebted to the work of kin keepers all of these methodologies inform the way that we initially did our work. Of course, during COVID, we're much more virtual, but we began, and up until February of 2020, we're a largely mobile organization going out into communities and learning from them about their sense of place and their challenges with identifying place. And that informs our three functions as an organization, as Texas Freedom Colonies Project. We're an educational social justice initiative dedicated to preservation of Black settlements landscapes, heritage and grassroots preservation practice through participatory research. So we do three things. We connect and collect placemaking, keeping stories and histories. We counter map and secure data from varied sources. And we co-create engage applied research based on the other two activities, or rooted in the other two activities. And so how does all this happen? One of the ways in which we communicate this information is through the atlas. The atlas is a combination of that box you see at the top, which is all this publicly available data, and the bottom, which is kin keeping. That is the information people upload when they fill out the survey, which populates the map. And each of those surveys produces a point on the map. And in the survey, you're given the option to tag or point on the map to an exact location. And so I do want to give you some context for the questions that we ask, because we often say, that we collect stories. But I have to qualify and say we collect stories of place origins, events that precipitate return, their most significant sites, their residency status of part-time or full-time or non-resident, and whether they live on commonly owned land, about their preservation experiences and challenges, their challenges around preserving property and land retention, who they rely on for help with taxes, land and community services, access to the internet and quality water, and when and if ever they've experienced the support that they needed from government planners or preservationists. And what do we get? What comes up on the map? Well, one of the many things we get are stories like these. This is a story from Cynthia Matlock. And she begins by saying she's not sure how it started, and then begins to give copious details about churches, when people still go to church, the time the church was founded, where you can find information, where people lived in the woods, the type of animals there, and then joy, right? So embedded in this story is not just the story of the details, but what it felt like to be in place, about the food they ate and how they felt safe. And of course, there's the populating on the map. So you can see the drop box there is actually showing you that information that someone uploaded about, in this case, Ennis, Texas. These are other tabs that you can go to on the atlas, which give you a dashboard of different sources, or rather the number of settlements by source, meaning the types of survey instruments people use. And of course, at the bottom, what we see here that's significant is where these places intersect with risk, with hurricanes. And in this case, you're seeing Texas Department of Transportation projects underway now or in the next 5 years, so that people can see the nexus of those projects with their communities. So what do we know as a result of this? Well, we have 696 unique records, 664 place names. 45 of the settlements we have now were not even on our original list. We have 90 plus full place narratives, new place narratives uploaded. We've been able to increase markers and historic designations for these places. We've been adopted as part of desktop reviews by archaeologists and environmental reviewers. And we've expanded not just into continually talking about the atlas, but also creating a platform for more people to learn about heritage conservation through our Adopt a County program. The young lady with the glasses in this picture upper in the corner is named Skylar Carter, and she's a doctoral student. She's a great leader who's making the Adopt a County program exciting for people anywhere from age 25 to 85. And we're returning to the field. And we also have Coffee Talk, which is a talk show online for talking with descendants and giving them a platform. And we're also beginning to unpack and analyze bills such as the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And we also are doing legal education. And so what are the lessons here? Land loss is ever present and a living trauma intertwined with familial relationships. Outside places, property and people matter. Air property is vulnerable if families don't know where their land is or who their kin is. Land is lost if just one person sells their share. Expanding the wealth gap. New applications of kin keeping practice can help make these places strategically visible. And the Justice for Black Farmers Act, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, these reforms are valuable, but require we also create culturally responsive modes of dispersal, of education, of relationality, and involvement in individual and collective spaces. And I want to end with one of those, or an example of an attempt to relate or integrate these principles into some of the work we do. So I will play a little of this video before I close.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me all along this pilgrim journey. I want Jesus to walk with me. For all of you ministers, pastors, parishioners, and community members, in this video, I'm going to talk about the importance and benefits of incorporating your church. Now, what is church incorporation?
And with that, I want to thank all of you, and I look forward to being in dialogue with you about these kin keepers, these place preservationists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for that really riveting, thoughtful, and beautifully articulated talk. And right now, we are going to open up our discussion for questions and comments. I definitely have a question, comment, but I first wanted to allow all of our participants to ask questions and offer comments. And so I am going to jump right in because we have a question that has come up. For you, Dr. Roberts, the type of relationships Black families make with the land are quite similar to concentric land relationships of Indigenous Americans. The big difference, of course, is time on the particular land. This is a relationship quite different from the settlers' relationship to land. What can our Black and Indigenous communities, what can our Black and Indigenous communities share, give, exchange with each other around these ideas of land, disposability, and erasure?
A lot. But I would be remiss in all of the presentations that I did. I do want to make sure that I actually foreground the work of people who are doing engagement with this question really deeply, and not as a side, but as at the center of the work, such as T.L. King and Marguerite Smith and Eve Tuck and others who are really deeply engaging this question of collaboration rooted in reality. And one of the things that I wanted to foreground here is I think there has to be some honesty and recognition of the difference. You know, we come to the table and say, well, I wasn't like those colonizers. So there is an act of collaborate, there is an action of colonization that we engaged in, Because people say, well, freedom colonies, why would you want to be called that? Well, they're colonizing an unfree space and making it free. That was never meant for them to carve out their own realities, which is an act of territorialization in a way that is about survival, and it's about perpetuating their space. However, I would say that we don't have any choice but to contemplate going forward land in relationship. So our universities is a terrain on which we should begin to do this work. And what I mean is, at the same time that we're talking about slavery in the university, people are talking about land grabs in the university. And so on that level, which seems very, huge and broad, is we're talking about funding universities and contemplating slavery. At the land grants, we also have to contemplate the land grabs, right? And so I think this is a space where we can have a very public, huge, in-your-face conversation to get people's attention. They're like, oh, I see how that kind of is intertwined there. So that's what I want to say about that. I also think that supporting the work of Native groups who are not recognized, unrecognized tribes, that's something that I'm interested in for my work. What I see as my contribution is, how do we translate this platform to supporting unrecognized tribes who can spatialize through story their migration, their forced migration patterns, et cetera, right? So those are some ways that I think practically about bringing the movements together, the work together.
Thank you so much for that. One of our listeners, actually, Daniel Pufroy, which I'm hoping I pronounced that name, who's hanging out with us today, says, thanks so much for this talk. You ended on a bit of a cliffhanger for me. I'm curious, can you say more about church incorporation?
Bless you, Danielle. Only you. I love you. I will send you more of the video. We are producing more of it. Felicia York, that is in the video, is a descendant of Freedom College. She's also a student at Texas A&M, Ph.D. student. And church incorporation is super duper important because in the midst of these communities, we think very much about, okay, we're thinking about farmers, we think about landholders, and people don't think about these small churches. And people say, well, go get a grant or, to help you with supporting your cemetery or this, and they don't have any legal status. Now, by default, they are nonprofits, but you need a registered 501c3 status in order to take advantage of certain funding streams. And so one of the things that we're working on is some baseline educational material that lets these rural churches know about incorporation. And we're doing this in partnership with Texas A&M School of Law. We're doing all of this legal education, and we're trying to produce legal education that integrates these womanist sensibilities in presentation. And so, yes, there's more. That was just the very beginning of the video because I felt like I went a little long. So yes, I'll share it with you, but it's an instructional video about the steps to be taken. And then what that benefit gets you. And then also the liabilities, we have little, diagrams showing, well, what if someone gets in a fight on your property, who do they sue? Do they sue you or do they sue the church? Well, if you're incorporated, you sue the church, and all of those kind of really basics to some people, but to these communities, not at all. So I can say that much. These are not mega churches. They don't have like 20 million lawyers. That's not the audience we're talking about here. We're talking about the churches that are in the beginning of that video that are have no legal standing in a lot of ways.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question that I'd like to add to the discussion, and really from the moment I thought about your talk and the moment you began to speak, I was wondering about, your talk is so engaged with why these pieces of land are so valuable to not only communities, but to how we think about Black life. And against the backdrop of the racial protests that we've seen over the last year, your scholarship in this presentation demonstrates why Black lives matter. Can you say a little bit more, and if you could give that sort of punctuated description of why Black place matters, right? And what is it about Black place that matters? Again, it gets a backdrop of this sort of longer discussion that we've been having, and this sort of racial justice reckoning some of the nation is having, and for others, you know, we're just sort of beating the drum again. But again, why Black place matters so much?
So place is a very deliberate term and word that I use. I work in and around and adjacent to historic preservation, but I really assert place preservation because it's cognizant of a type of keeping of the space that is holistic, meaning the landscape. It's the trees, it's the outhouse, it's the smokehouse, it's the house, it's the spring. And so that is the nature of place integrity, is the relationships between everything on the land and below the land. So when I talk about place and I talk about why Black places matter, we have a relationality between Black people and land corrupted by racial capitalism, of course, right? And so if we can't see our places as our places, then we're just going to keep reifying that Black capitalism. And part of seeing, you know, Black places is understanding how they came to be. And that's important as we talk about land acquisition and retention and all of these things. And so to understand how they came to be was seeing a process of intention of creation, that we have the capacity of intelligent design, so that when we look at planning and we look at all of these practices, we don't say those are practices I'm not familiar with coming in, but that we have our own epistemology and ontology of place. And so there's by saying Black places matter, we recognize there is such a thing as a Black place. And for it to be a Black place, it's not Black because someone ascribed that externally to us, but because there is something about us in the way that we practice that created that place. And it's that sense of self-assuredness, confidence, that is not just about pride, but it's about understanding our capacity and how we come to the table and what we ask for. And again, how we don't just ask for and act in the same ways that we've always been acting. And so that's kind of a critical point that I see right now is the floodgates will open and there will be this largesse disseminated in the forms of this project and that project and billions here and billions there. But if we don't have this idea of Black place that's beyond, here's the map and the grant tells me to show you where the concentration of the Black people are because the census dots say so, then we're not doing anything different than we did before. We're not going to get anything different than we got before. So that's why it's important.
That was absolutely beautiful. I'm sort of reading the questions as they come in. So the next question is, I'm curious to know if there might be some interaction between the Black freedom between the Black freedom colonies. The Women's Commonwealth violated gender expectations by declaring themselves celibate. They were certainly racist, like most white Texans, but they appropriate looking for freedom in community. So I think that the question is trying to understand the links between
Yes.
the Women's Commonwealth and the Black freedom colonies that your research is on.
So I'm guessing that she's talking maybe about the Women's Barnyard Auxiliary that I talked about in the beginning. Is she referring to that possibly, or because the Women's Commonwealth is a new terminology for me. I'm not really clear on that.
Okay, so the women's community in Belton and Waco, Texas.
Ah, Okay. So I am not really familiar with that. Can you start with the question again? Help me out here. I want to be attentive to the question, but
Yeah.
maybe.
The question is, I'm curious to know if there might have been some interaction between the Black Freedom Colonies and what's being described as the Woman's Commonwealth.
Yes.
Okay.
No, those women were very racist. So, okay, yes, I'm remembering. I'm so sorry. Yes, I remember now. They were kind of a women's clan, right? And so part of the things that I struggle with, this is what I think this can answer, which might be a related question, is how are you strategically visible? Because a lot of people say you're mapping these places, you're making them visible. And part of the ways that they were able in the past to make sure the Women's Commonwealth didn't come and just kill them in the night is because they knew how to be strategically invisible. Because they were dangerous. The Women's Commonwealth was just a white supremacist organization. And they happen to be women. So what we actually see is the necessity of visibility right now. That's the irony here, and that's the difference that in the time being described, because that interaction was okay. Well, we have certain people. I mean, we have certain people we need to protect ourselves from. So there's a level of self-sufficiency we require, so that we don't have to leave and interact with those kind of people. And so everything was predicated around how do I not even have to interact with those people? Not how do I get to be with those people, or how do I make those people like me? It was how do we defend our people from those people? Otherwise, there would have been clearly all of this history about these massacres of the many settlements around Waco.
This is from Claudia Ford. This probably might be our last question, but what do you think about Charles Blow's work and his argument about the return, that Black people should return to the South? So I'll just read it. What do you think about Charles Blow's work that promotes bringing Black political power back to the South through repatriation of Southern states? Which of course Texas would be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a mass return to the South by Black people since the 1970s, and it's been pretty acute. In terms of like everybody come back to the South, the moment we do that, they'd all move somewhere else and take the capital with them. It's just because it's like, what have we seen? It's like, well, you could say, look at Chicago. What if we did? What if we all stayed on this part of Chicago? What happens every time? I'm just saying, as much as part of me is just like with glee, everybody come back to the South. Come on back. Yeah, please. We have a lot of Black people in the South. We don't have the political power, and we have state legislatures that are the problem in the South. So I think there's some political acumen that's needed in support and money from various parties that need to come to the South, coupled with people coming to the South.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that assessment. That was suburbanization, right?
Right.
Everybody's in the city. GIs come back, white folks dip, capital goes with them.
Right.
Here you go. I know we are at the end of our time. I guess I will say thank you so much for this brilliant talk, for your thoughtfulness in terms of the questions, and you've left us, really breathless, and we want more. And so we're looking forward to your scholarship coming out. We're going to be digging into the research that you've been doing. I want to check with my colleagues to make sure there isn't anything else I need to do. JT, Justin.
No, I want to say, thank you, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Shabazz, for such a wonderful discussion and conversation. Thank you to all of the folks who've come and who've been watching on YouTube, and, feel free to sort of share the clips around. And please do join us next week. Next Wednesday, we'll continue our discussion with the third iteration, which will be, again, the kind of open forum that we had for the first discussion. Justin, is there anything that you wanted to say?
No, maybe I just wanted to announce a few people who are going to be next week. Our discussion number 2 will be Wednesday, April 14th at 2:30 Pacific Standard Time, 5:30 Eastern Time. And it'll be hosted by Leah Kaplan, and we'll have Ebony Golden, Eva Dickerson, and Emerald Rutledge in conversation, Dr. Hilda Lorenz, Johnny Cruz Mercer, Dr. Randy Gill Sadler, and Tiana Williams. So looking forward to seeing you all.
Yes. And we're going to end the recording and all of that. If folks linger, we won't hold you for that, but we also are respecting everyone's time. So I know Dr. Roberts probably like, I'm out, but we appreciate you all so much. And thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.